If it's Wednesday, President Biden and President Zelenskyy face to face. Ukraine's leader makes a dramatic wartime visit to the White House today. The two leaders expected to hold a press conference this hour ahead of Zelenskyy's historic address to a joint session of Congress tonight. Plus, developing right now on Capitol Hill, the January 6th committee is delaying the release of the full report. They are now expected to go public tomorrow with every bombshell piece of evidence it has. And it urges the Justice Department to prosecute the former president and disqualify him from ever holding high office again. In a state of emergency, in a state of uncertainty, state, local, and federal officials brace for a surge in border crossings that could start at any moment, with the fate of a pandemic-era border restriction now in the hands of the Supreme Court. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Yamisha Sendor in for Chuck Todd. We begin with breaking news amid a historic wartime visit to Washington. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is here in the nation's capital after leaving his country for the first time since the Russian invasion of Ukraine nearly 10 months ago. So far, he's met with President Biden, his cabinet and national security team, and will soon be holding a press conference at the White House before addressing a joint session of Congress tonight. In the Oval Office this afternoon, Zelenskyy thanked the U.S. government and the American people for their support.
All my appreciations from my heart, from the heart of Ukrainians, all Ukrainians, from our nation, strong nations, all the appreciation to you, first of all, Mr. President, for your big support and leadership. Thanks, Congress, and thanks from our just ordinary people to your ordinary people, Americans. I really appreciate. I think it's very difficult to understand what does it mean when we say appreciate, but you really have to feel it. And thank you so much. Great honor to be here.
The White House announced a new $2 billion aid package for Ukraine, and according to President Biden, that includes a Patriot missile battery, the world's premier defensive missile system. Here's what President Biden had to say in the Oval Office.
We're going to continue to strengthen Ukraine's ability to defend itself, particularly air defense, and that's why we're going to be providing Ukraine with Patriot missile battery and training your forces to be able to accurately use it. President Zelenskyy, the United States stands with the brave people in Ukraine. We stand with you. You've been a great leader. And by the way, we have a famous thing that occurs once a year. We pick the Man of the Year in Time magazine. You are the Man of the Year in the United States of America.
Zelenskyy's visit comes at a moment when some Republicans are questioning the involvement of the U.S. in the war and the cost of aid. The House's top Republican, Kevin McCarthy, is warning that his incoming Republican majority will not write Ukraine a, quote, blank check. But notably, Republican and Democratic leaders over in the Senate today cheered Zelenskyy's visit and renewed their support for Ukraine.
Continuing our support for Ukraine is morally right, but it's not only that. It's also a direct investment in cold, hard American interest.
I hope all House Republicans will attend the Zelenskyy address this evening. And when they do, they should listen to President Zelenskyy describe the horror his people have endured at the hands of Vladimir Putin.
For more on today's news, NBC's Monica Alba is at the White House. NBC's Matt Bradley is on the ground in Kyiv. NBC's Courtney Cuby is at the Pentagon. And also with me on set is former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Bill Taylor. He is now Vice President for Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute for Peace. So, Monica, it was moving to hear President Zelenskyy say Ukraine appreciates so much the aid that the U.S. has been giving that country. Talk to us more about what we've been hearing from these two men and what more we know about this visit so far.
Emotional comments, Yamiche, you're right, from President Zelenskyy talking about wanting to give a service award from one of the Ukrainian service members to President Biden, exchanging that, and then President Biden replying by saying we have a tradition in this country about exchanging challenge coins, and even invoking his late son, Beau Biden, who served in Iraq. And so, of course, you see the two men there, very friendly. They have been in frequent contact throughout the war after the Russian invasion in February. And even President Zelenskyy said there he wanted to get to the U.S. sooner. He just said it was so complicated and there were so many different moving pieces, so many security concerns that they couldn't get it done until now, with the war entering, of course, its 10-month, nearly 300 days after that. So you saw President Biden there pledge that additional defense missile system, the Patriot battery, which is critical, something the Ukraine military has been asking for a very long time. And then the two men saying we're going to have this extended conversation about other factors. There's so much here to determine in terms of next steps, but the U.S. has been very clear that they want to have a conversation about diplomacy and what potential negotiating strategy could be on the table here, but that today's visit is one more about solidarity and showing that instead of trying to nudge President Zelenskyy in any way in terms of what to do next. But you can bet that next we are going to hear the two men take questions about what they did discuss in this more extended bilateral, and that is where a lot of Washington is wondering, with a divided Congress coming up, how that's going to all play out. And you'll hear more about that, of course, in the joint address tonight.
And Monica, you were just talking about the fact that there's some sense that this is about negotiations, possibly, even though the U.S. doesn't want to nudge President Zelenskyy anyway. That being said, is your sense that the U.S., in giving this Patriot systems, that it's showing that the White House thinks that there isn't going to be a diplomatic end to this war? Or do you think that there is some sense that Zelenskyy might be counseled to have some more negotiations with Russia, Monica?
The U.S. has said from the beginning that there's nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So I think senior administration officials and even the president here, when he takes questions, will say, I can recommend what I think, but this is really going to be up to President Zelenskyy to decide, and that, of course, we support Ukraine. That's, I think, what you can expect to hear from the president and his top aides in a little bit, as the national security teams are also meeting to hash this out. But you're right. This is a pivotal moment in the war, and given that it is going deeper into winter now with the hard ground and the potential for a more intense Russian offensive, there are all these questions, and that is why the weapon system becomes a little bit more important for Ukraine. But at the same time, the president has said, of course, ideally they would like to see this conflict come to an end, to what President Zelenskyy often refers to in the form of just peace. So what that exact definition is, I think that is where the U.S. is going to come in and say that is not for us to determine or define. That is for President Zelenskyy. But absolutely, that was a huge part of their conversation behind closed doors today.
And Matt, you're there in Ukraine. There are so many people there facing a cold winter, as well as continued bombardment from Russia. How is President Zelenskyy's trip, as well as the U.S.'s decision to send this Patriot missile system, how is all of that being viewed on the ground there?
Well, with immense gratitude. And that's something that I've been hearing both from ordinary people on the street and from government officials. And we heard it from Zelenskyy today. He's saying not just the government of Ukraine, but the people of Ukraine, to the ordinary people of America, expressing that incredible gratitude, because the United States really has been putting up more money, more weapons than any other individual country in the world. And that is something that is felt very much here in the halls of power in Kyiv. And, you know, this is something that is critical at this moment, because this is really a moment of impasse in Ukraine. There has been quite a lot of victories for the Ukrainians on the battlefield over the summer and into the fall. But over the past several weeks, the battlefield has been frozen. Both literally and figuratively. You know, he mentioned Bakhmut, where President Zelenskyy was just really 24 hours ago. And that's where the fiercest fighting is. And it really is quite intense fighting. But the front line there has not been moving. So even though the Ukrainians feel buoyed by the victories that they've had over the past several months, they really need a game changer. And that's why President Zelenskyy is in Washington, not just to express gratitude, but also you can believe that he's going to be asking for more. Those Patriot missiles were something that only a couple of months ago, Washington said, no way, we're not going to give them to you. I was speaking to a member of Zelensky's political party just this afternoon here, and she was saying, look, we went from a hard no on those Patriot missiles to now we're about to take receipt of those missiles, and they could be a game changer. What they want are more. They want offensive weapons, long-range missiles, not just these surface-to-air missiles like the Patriots, but also surface-to-surface missiles. Washington is still reluctant to give those because that would give the Ukrainians the capability of striking deep within Russia or even Crimea, which is not so deep within Russia, but that's something that is Ukrainian land that was illegally annexed by Russia back in 2014, 2015. They want that back, and having the capability to project their power directly into Crimea or further into actual Russia, that could be a game changer, but it could spark concerns and has sparked concerns in Washington that it could create an escalation that could lead to, well, we don't know, something like nuclear weapons, which is still a major concern. The people I speak to here, they dismiss all of this talk of nuclear weapons and say that this is not something that they think Putin is going to be doing anytime soon. It's all just empty talk. But at the same time, it's something that a lot of people throughout the world are wondering, especially people like American taxpayers who are ponying up quite a bit of cash. Namisha? Excuse me.
Thanks, Matt. And then when you think about the fact that, what Matt is talking about there, Courtney, is sort of the state of the war. You had Zelenskyy when he was in the Oval Office saying, I did not feel comfortable leaving my country months ago. Now I do feel comfortable. It felt like a message almost to Russia that, hey, I feel a little bit better about where things are. Can you talk to us a bit about how confident this moment might be? Because, confident, I should say, President Zelenskyy might be in this moment, Courtney, given the fact that he's made the decision to leave?
Yeah, that's right. So, this is coming on the heels of a pretty big victory for the Ukrainian military in the south, down in an area called in and around Kherson, where the Russian military retreated south across the river, and they've really moved into these defensive positions there. That was a big win for the Ukrainian military, even though you could make the argument that the Russians retreated. It wasn't necessarily all of a Ukrainian military win. But again, that was a victory. As Matt was saying, up in the east, sort of northeast area, Bakhmut, it's really a pretty much at a stalemate now, although there are U.S. officials who are saying that the Russians are making very, very, very small but a little bit of progress on a day-to-day basis. We're talking feet or even literally feet or yards on a day-to-day basis, but still tiny bit of progress. So the operational tempo is somewhat slowed from where we saw it just a few weeks ago. That is absolutely true. But, back on this weapons package, everyone is really focused on the Patriot system. And yes, that provides a very important air defense system. It provides what the military calls a layered system. So this gives the Ukrainians the ability to take out incoming, including cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and aircraft. Don't forget about aircraft, at a much higher altitude and a greater distance than they have with some of their other systems like the S-300s. But this package of nearly $2 billion has a ton of other capabilities in it that we're not really talking about. A really important one, also the first time the U.S. has ever provided it, are called JDAMs. These are systems that are attached to essentially a dumb bomb that may make them precision-guided munitions. This could be somewhat of a game changer on the ground. This will provide the Ukrainian military with the ability to have a much more precise attack capability against the Russians. In addition to that, though, this package has hundreds of Soviet-era rounds that may sound surprising to many of our viewers, Amish, and that's because, remember, the Ukrainian military has a lot of old Soviet-era systems. The U.S. has been sending in HIMARS and now this Patriot system and things, but they're trying now to help supply ammunition for some of the older Ukrainian systems that will also provide them with more attack capability and air defense capability. In addition to that, this package also includes some satellite communication capability, giving the Ukrainian military the ability to keep talking when some of their systems have been getting knocked out. So this is a really well-rounded, enormous package of equipment. And while we're focused so much on the Patriots, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this provides a lot of other capabilities. Some of them, like the JDAMs, will be really critical in the coming weeks when there's bad weather during the winter. We should, one of the big questions I'm really watching for today is whether President Zelenskyy talks about whether he thinks there's going to be a coming Russian Russian offensive when we're in really the heart of the winter. So not just where we are right now, where it's really cold in Ukraine, but where there's a permafrost, where it becomes easier for these large tanks and wheeled vehicles and tracked vehicles to move across some of the frozen ground, Yamiche.
Well, this is all such important reporting. It really does level set where we are in this moment. Thank you so much, Monica, Matt, Courtney. Now, of course, Ambassador Taylor, I want to bring you in. I start in some ways where I finished with Courtney, which is what does really President Zelenskyy need in this next phase in the war? And what's the expectation that he might get more given the fact that he's here in person making the ask?
Yamiche, I think that both Matt and Courtney have highlighted an important point. That is, the United States has gone up in its willingness to provide heavy weapons and more sophisticated weapons. It started off low and it's gone up, and now we're at Patriots and JDAMs, as both have described. That's a very good sign, and I suspect that President Zelenskyy and President Biden will have had this conversation about what's the next step. Because, exactly as Courtney says, there is the possibility that the Ukrainians could mount an offensive before the Russians. And if they can preempt the Russians and put the Russians on their back foot, keep them on their back foot, and have the Ukrainians be on the front foot, on the offensive, that can disrupt these Russian plans. And so that could be a real game changer. That could be the game changer where the Russians fall back. And that's what President Zelenskyy will be talking about.
That could certainly be a game changer. You also talk about Russian plans. How much could today's visit, and as well as the U.S. making this idea that they're going to now provide the Patriot missile system, how could all of that be seen as a provocation by Russia? Could this make things worse, even though it's hard to even think about things being worse because things are pretty bad now?
Things are pretty bad now, but mainly on the civilian side, because the Russians are losing on the battlefield. They're doing poorly on the battlefield, but the only thing they can do is attack unarmed civilian targets. Civilians, killing women and children, old people. This is all the Russians are left to do. So, yes, they are on their back foot. And they've talked before about how they're not pleased with these weapons going from the Americans and other NATO allies, by the way, to the Ukrainians, but they've never been able to do anything about it.
So it sounds like you're saying this visit isn't going to make sort of Russia any worse than it already is, because this is really sort of par for the course. They were going to continue to escalate.
And I think that the Russians are watching very carefully to see how the Americans react.
Yeah.
I mean, the Americans are describing, we are providing support for the Ukrainians, and that, according to all the message so far, we'll see how it goes tonight, is that's going to persist. That's going to last. There's another $44 billion that the Congress is about to vote on this week, and that's a message to the Russians as well.
And thinking about the aid that Congress is voting on, you already have some Republicans, Kevin McCarthy being one of them, saying that there needs to be a sort of slowdown in aid to Russia, that this can't be a blank check. Susan Collins says that these political divisions, it could embolden Russia. What's your sense of that? What do you think about that, what she's saying there?
I think she's right. President Putin, of course, would like to see divisions in the Americans, among the Americans, within the American people and society and politicians. But Putin has to be really disappointed that all of this weapons, all of this assistance, all of financial assistance, humanitarian assistance continues to come. And I suspect this $44 billion will be passed with overwhelming majorities again this week. And that's, again, a message that President Putin cannot be happy about when he sees that the strongest supporter, United States, is continuing, is persistent in its support for Ukraine, and it's not going to stop.
And in thinking about sort of where this is happening, there is this winter that we've been talking about. Do you think this could be a morale boost for people on the ground in Ukraine to see this visit? And I wonder how worried you are when you think about the winter that's coming and the possible Russian offensive if that happens.
I do worry. I've got very good friends across Ukraine, some in the army, some that we worked with while I was there before. And they tell me that they're having to do amazing things to make it through this winter. It's starting to get cold. It'll get colder, and it's going to be harder and harder. And the Russians' attacks on the electricity, which means no water, which means no heat, which means no communications, which means no electricity, no light, Putin wants to try to wreck the morale of the Ukrainians, and he's failing. The Ukrainians get angrier and angrier and more determined to win, to beat the Russians. They will not succumb.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ambassador Bill Taylor. It's so important to have you here on an important day like this one. And we will bring you President Biden and President Zelensky's press conference live as soon as it happens. And tonight, after President Zelensky addresses Congress, be sure to watch our NBC News Now special from inside Ukraine. In the days after the city of Izum was liberated, our NBC team spent weeks inside the bombed-out city, hearing the stories of those who survived the Russian occupation and those who didn't. Life, Death, and Liberation in Ukraine airs tonight at 10:30 p.m. Eastern on NBC News Now. We'll be right back with Senator Chris Murphy. You're watching NBC News Now and Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As we've been saying, today is a very busy one in Washington. Not only is the Ukrainian president, President Zelenskyy, set to speak momentarily with President Biden and then address a joint session of Congress this evening, the Senate is in the midst of voting on a $1.7 trillion spending bill that includes more money for Ukraine, a year's worth of government funding, as well as an overhaul of the Electoral Count Act to eliminate the legal ambiguities that Trump supporters tried to exploit in January 2021. Additionally, border policy is in flux as the pandemic-era Title 42 policy is now in limbo after the Supreme Court temporarily halted its expiration. Joining me now to talk about all of this is Connecticut Democratic Senator Chris Murphy. He's a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and a member of the Senate Ukraine Caucus. So, Senator, thank you for being here. We know that President Zelenskyy is set to address Congress tonight. What's your sense of what the U.S. and Ukraine want to accomplish, especially as this visit comes at a critical time in the war?
Well, first, it's just going to be an extraordinary scene tonight. I can't wait to be there. I've gotten to know President Zelenskyy over the years, having traveled there probably over a half dozen times. And remember, this is a leader who most experts thought would be deposed from power within days of the Russian invasion, a leader that many told he was told to flee to avoid capture or execution. He didn't flee. He stood his ground, and that is the reason, in large part, today that Ukraine is winning battles against Russia. I think the message here is twofold. One, it's to the Ukrainian people that the United States stands shoulder to shoulder with them. This is a day in which President Zelenskyy will appear before Congress. It is also a day in which we will authorize $46 billion in new funding to support their war. The message is also to Europe that we're not going away, and we hope that the Europeans are going to stick with us. And lastly, it's a message to Putin. Putin's going to be very upset, angry, embarrassed tonight. This is a war he thought he could win within weeks, and he's going to see a united front between Ukraine and the American people, and a signal that we're going to stick with Ukraine for the long haul.
And, Senator, we have heard some senators, including down the Democratic and Republican side, saying just what you said, which is that the U.S. is going to stick with Ukraine in the long haul. But you've also seen, in some ways, Republicans who are incoming, House Republicans, saying that they are worried about how much aid Ukraine is getting. What's your sense of the support inside the Congress for Ukraine and how that could change?
I think one of the big reasons why we are approving $46 billion in aid this week is because there's not a lot of trust that House Republicans care about Ukraine in the way that America cares about Ukraine. You have heard signals from the incoming Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy that there won't be a lot of support for Ukraine from his caucus. So the $46 billion that we're authorizing right now, it's a lot of money, but it's a lot of money because we expect it to be enough to last Ukraine for all of or most of next year, so that we don't have to rely on these unreliable House Republicans who are coming into the majority.
And another thing that I want to ask you about when it comes to Ukraine is, of course, the Patriot missile systems that the United States is saying it's going to provide. What's your sense of your support for that move? And also, do you think there should be more given to Ukraine, given the fact that we know Ukraine is pushing to get more?
So I think we've been very clear with Russia from the beginning of two things. One, there's not going to be American troops in Ukraine. We don't seek a direct conflict with Russia. And two, we are going to be somewhat judicious about the systems we transfer to Ukraine. We're not going to enable Ukraine to carry out attacks in Russia. But we've also been very clear we're going to help Ukraine protect itself. And right now, Russia's tactic is to target civilians, is to target civilian infrastructure, to try to kill Ukrainian children and families by starving them to death or to have them freeze in their homes. We've got to provide Ukraine the mechanism to protect their civilians. And right now, it's the Patriot that is probably the best way to shoot these Russian missiles out of the sky. So I know that Zelenskyy is always pushing the envelope. That's his job. He should do that. But I think it still makes sense for the United States to draw these two basic lines: no American troops on the ground there, and being careful to provide defensive weapons, not weapons that are going to be used in attacks inside Russia.
And then my last point about weapons that could be used inside Russia, do you think the U.S. should be sending long-range missiles to Ukraine as they are requesting the United States do?
Listen, I think we're going to continue to be in a dialogue with them about what systems they need and how they are going to use them. Again, I am very comfortable with the two bottom lines that I articulated, but there may be situations in which they need more missile capacity to just protect their own territory and hit targets inside Ukraine. So let's continue this dialogue. I'm sure we'll all be very eager to hear the recommendations that President Zelenskyy has tonight.
And Senator, we've been talking about democracy in Ukraine. I want to ask you about democracy here. The omnibus is going to have this reform for the Electoral Count Act. How significant is that?
It's really significant. This is an 1887 law that governs how the Electoral College works. And what we found out in 2020 is that there are a lot of vulnerabilities. Now, Trump wasn't able to successfully exploit any of them. But, for instance, you saw this ambiguity over, could the vice president actually cast a vote? Could they cancel votes out when they're presiding over the Senate? Well, we took all those potential ambiguities and we got rid of them. So Republicans and Democrats wrote a new version of the Electoral Count Act, which makes it very clear that states have to abide by their law for picking electors, and they can't change up their electors just because they don't like how the election turned out. So this limits the avenues for a corrupt presidential candidate like Donald Trump to try to steal the election. It doesn't eliminate that possibility, I'll be honest, but it just narrows the avenues that somebody like Trump would have to try to steal an election after the vote is counted.
And in thinking of that, is your sense that this is going to be the only legislative action that Congress will take to try to prevent another Capitol attack, or might there be even more ways to try to narrow that possibility?
Well, we beef up some of the aspects of the budget that try to track these terror groups, these domestic terror groups. So there, are going to be new capacities in this budget to try to root out groups that are planning attacks against the United States Capitol. We are going to, open back up for business next year. We still have limited access, and I think you will, see, increased security here. And of course, it just helps to have a president who wants to defend the Capitol rather than Donald Trump, a president who was willing to let us all die on January 6th.
Strong words, Senator, but I know there are a lot of people who agree with you. Finally, Title 42, the border policy. What should Congress and the Biden administration be doing to prepare for its possible end there? What do you want to see happening?
Well, let's just be clear. This is a problem created by congressional inaction. Congress hasn't passed any comprehensive immigration reform because Republicans have blocked it, and thus we have basically an ongoing crisis at the border because we have tons of people showing up, and we don't have the right pathways with which to process them. We're going to have a lot of people coming to the United States once Title 42 is lifted. That's the authority that we used under COVID to expel migrants without allowing them to make an asylum claim. The law of the United States says you can only use that authority when there's a COVID emergency. Without the COVID emergency, you've got to allow people to apply for asylum, and we need resources to process those asylum claims. We put about $2.5 billion in this budget to help with those high numbers of people arriving at the budget, but that number probably should have been twice as much. Again, Republicans were only willing to agree to this amount. So I think you're going to see some troubling images at the border. border in January and February and March, and that can be solved by increased resources that Republicans are unwilling to provide us, or comprehensive immigration reform, which so far Republicans have been unwilling to pass.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Chris Murphy. A lot to talk about there.
Thank you.
And up next, the January 6th committee has just delayed the unveiling of their entire report on the investigation into the attack on the Capitol. We'll have the latest up next. Plus, we're live on the border with new developments in the back and forth over border policy, as the Biden administration is now asking the Supreme Court to delay the end of Title 42. And of course, we will bring you President Biden's press conference with Ukraine's President Zelenskyy as soon as it happens. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. We'll have to wait now until tomorrow to see the January 6th committee's final full report. It comes 2 days after the committee's final public meeting, in which it voted to send 4 criminal referrals of former President Trump to the Justice Department. It also comes as we await the release of the former president's tax returns. The House Ways and Means Committee voted last night to release 6 years of Trump's returns. NBC's Julie Tsirkin joins me now from Capitol Hill, and also with us is Vaughn, Hillyard in West Palm Beach, Florida, of course, right by Mar-a-Lago, the former President Trump's home. So, Julie, what is going on? Why is this delay happening?
Yeah, it's a great question, Yamiche. Look, I think we've heard all day from the committee that it was potentially printer issues. This is not that unlikely of a scenario given how big this report is. It's over 1,000 pages that the committee is expected to release. So it very well could be a printing issue, but you also have to look at the timeline of tonight's events as they're butting up against the deadline, of course, of Ukrainian President Zelensky's address that everyone has been talking about all day. So we know now that the committee isn't planning on releasing that report until tomorrow. They did say some material could drop today, where it's unclear as to what material they are talking about. But you're right, this comes just 2 days after the full panel voted on those criminal referrals for former President Trump, for John Eastman and some of his allies here in the House as well, to House Ethics, for example, some of those Republicans. So we're anxiously awaiting the reveal of this report. A reminder that even though the report is supposed to now drop tomorrow, the transcripts we're going to be seeing sort of trickling in the days after as well.
Printer issues, Julie. I mean, you can't make this up. This is Congress, though. Vaughn, the former president, he has been saying a lot, but also kind of relatively quiet on these big issues when you think about the fact that the January 6th committee voted to send criminal referrals against him to the DOJ. What are you expecting to hear from him, as well as those closest to him, when it comes to all of this?
Right. Things are about as quiet at Mar-a-Lago, where Donald Trump is staying, as they are at the Kinko's down the road here in West Palm Beach, where I know the printers are plentiful. So maybe we could get to work out here and help everybody up on Capitol Hill. You know, there is largely silence from the former president of the United States. He's posted a few links on his Truth social media account. He had suggested in a statement yesterday that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, referring to himself, suggesting that the investigation by the January 6th Select Committee is only empowering him and emboldening him as he's looking to return to the White House as part of this 2024 presidential run. But, you know, we are waiting here for some key details to come out, particularly from this report that could provide better understanding of what exactly was known by law enforcement agencies ahead of the January 6th attack, to what extent were the FBI and the Pentagon and the CIA, as well as others, aware of the threats that were posed to the Capitol Hill on that day. There's a lot of outstanding questions. Of course, Donald Trump is somebody who never complied with the subpoena from the January 6th Select Committee himself. Of course, there's also testimony that Department of Justice, we are sure, would be eager to get from the likes of his Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows. So a lot of the question marks that are still outstanding as it relates to the January 6th attack and the events leading up to it and after it, Donald Trump is very much at the center of having yet to answer the questions that are still outstanding here at this time, Yamiche.
And Vaughn, talking about other stories that have Donald Trump at the center, there is, of course, his upcoming release of his tax returns. What's your sense of how concerned the former president is, or people close to him, about those tax returns becoming public?
Right. I mean, it's important when we are looking at the scrutiny that is now years in the making of Donald Trump's not only businesses, but also personal finances. It was just less than a month ago that the Trump organization was found to have been engaged in a criminal scheme, a tax fraud scheme that lasted over the course of 15 years. Now the question here is, what more can we gather from Trump's tax returns? You'll recall on the campaign trail in 2015 and 2016, he maintained that he was under audit. But from this initial report that was put out by the Ways and Means Committee yesterday, they are suggesting that the IRS did not begin an audit of his 2015 and 2016 tax filings until 2019, when the Ways and Means Committee went to the IRS requesting information about Donald Trump's finances. And we now know that the IRS did not look at his tax filings over the course of the 4 years of his presidency until after he left office. So there are a lot of outstanding questions as to, number one, why audits were not conducted as they are supposed to by the IRS during the course of his own presidency, but also the extent to which the tax returns can be wholly understood, because it may take several days. There's a lot that goes into auditing tax returns, and that is where it may not be clear just when the committee is going to release those exactly what they all mean.
And Julie, to that point, what this all means is a critical question. What's your sense of what we're actually going to see in those tax returns, what lawmakers, Democrats in particular, what they think the big takeaways might be?
Yeah, look, we saw that 29-page report kind of highlighting the top lines of this, and as Vaughn just laid out, it was over those 6 years of tax returns for President Trump. We saw the top lines of that just yesterday, but of course, this will take some time to see because of those audits. When they do release them, we know that Chairman Neal of the Ways and Means Committee, he wants Congress to vote to codify, to force essentially the IRS to conduct these audits every single year for sitting presidents and not wait, like Vaughn just outlined, years before even starting that. There's currently no law that sort of requires them to do that. It's just this unspoken rule that the IRS is going to be doing this year by year. So that is legislatively what Neal really wants to do. And in the Senate, I mean, that's something that Chair Wyden, who's chairing the Finance Committee, really wants to take on as well. He said that today in a news statement. So all of these deadlines getting pushed together, but it's also because Republicans, of course, are going to take control of the House, where all these investigations then can die.
Well, Julie, Vaughn, thank you so much for all your reporting on Congress, Trump, and those printers. And up next, we're live at the U.S.-Mexico border as officials brace for a surge of migrants when the pandemic-era policy known as Title 42 ends. But before we go to break, we've got a special Meet the Press holiday gift for you. The Chuck Todd cast is being visited by the ghost of Christmas past, exploring what could have been with a bit of alternate political history. What if Bill Clinton had resigned? Or what if President JFK had lived? The first episode of our special 4-part series, Meet the Alternative History, is available now wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.